Hey guys, welcome back. I'm sorry it's been kind of a minute since I did a recording since like last Sunday, but anyway, I actually have quite a few things to talk about that me and my fellow theorists have been discussing, and then I will get to the asks after that. I'm not in a huge hurry because we've got a while till season 3 comes out. I think in the meantime we'll have other spin-offs, like we'll probably get Dead City at some point, which I like. I like Dead City, just not as much, as Daryl Dixon. Anyway, so I'm going to start with talking about some things that we've been talking about. And a lot of them do have to do with the finale. They're things that I forgot to mention or that we've talked about since that I didn't, really realize when I was doing my recording for that. So yeah, next several videos we'll talk about those and the asks that I currently have. So let's dive in. The first one is actually fairly recent, and I'm sure some people have posted about it, but there was a promo that was put out by, let me check and see. Yeah, so it was AMC The Walking Dead, which is an official channel on Instagram. And it just has a picture of Daryl and Carol in the very last scene of the finale where they're walking into the tunnel, just that very last part. And it says, "There's always a light at the end of the tunnel." This is super important, guys. I mean, first of all, we have the tunnel symbolism, which I didn't talk about a whole lot because there was so much else to talk about. If you need a refresher, it's just this. People tend to go into the dark tunnel, and the dark tunnel, I do believe, represents death, or at least possible death, a brush with death, something like that. And if they come out on the other side, then they live, right? Now, it's important to understand that not everybody does come out on the other side. However, usually when we see tunnel symbolism, there is a resurrection element around it. So, for example, I first picked up the tunnel symbolism because it had a lot to do in season 4 with Maggie and Glenn. Remember that they got separated after the prison fell, and then they kind of reunited inside a tunnel. Interesting, right? If you look at that whole sequence, this is when Glenn was with Abraham and Rosita and Tara and Eugene. And Abraham decides he doesn't want to take Eugene into the tunnel, so they all split up, and Tara just goes with Glenn. And then, sure enough, there was so much important symbolism here. The roof had fallen in, and there were a ton of walkers, but they couldn't get through. And interestingly, I think Maggie had already gone through, and the tunnel fell in after them because they were firing their guns. But what happened is when she came out on the other side, Abraham and their party found Maggie, and so they went back in to get Glenn and Tara. And Glenn and Tara, almost died. They would have died if the group hadn't come back. And then, of course, that's when Maggie and Glenn reunited, and everything was lovely and all of that. So I do think that that is a template for the way that they often use this symbolism. And I'm sure that we have seen it with other characters. I'm not going to know off the top of my head when exactly, but if you went through, I'm sure that we've talked about it with other characters that were like Beth proxies and that sort of thing, but I'm not going to remember much of it. But the next thing that's interesting is that in season 5, Emily's name and Chad Coleman's name, Tyrese, were both in the tunnel. In the opening credits, I mean. So why is that interesting? Remember I said not everybody makes it out of the tunnel. I think the idea there was to see 2 people go into the tunnel and only one person come out. So it was like one of them was going in and was going to die. The other was going in and was going to live. Now, to the untrained eye, because their names were in the tunnel, and it doesn't look like either of them survived season 5. I mean, to the person who is not a TDer, right? And they would probably just look at that and say, no, it just means death. That's what it means because they both died. But the problem with that is that it didn't mean death in season 4. And it certainly didn't mean death here with Daryl and Carol. So it can't just mean death all the time. It's got to mean something else. I would argue that Daryl and Carol did have a brush with death here, but in their case, it wasn't really so much a physical brush. I mean, yes, there were walkers they had to kill, and they were both in dire situations. Like I said, poor Daryl got the crap kicked out of him at this part. He just couldn't seem to catch a break. But at the same time, they're always fighting walkers, right? They're always kind of stepping on eggshells with death because they're surrounded by the dead. So unless there is something really significant where it really looks like they're about to die and they're not going to make it out, that's not really the same thing to me, okay? But here, remember that I talked about how it was an emotional death for both of them, in a lot of ways, what you might call a shamanic death, if you know what that means. They both had the opportunity to give up, and they decided not to. They decided to live. Anyway, so to have them show a picture of this tunnel, and Daryl and Carol walking out the other side, and it's green. There's a lot of green light involved here, and say there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. Well, so that takes us to the next part of why this is important, and that is because it is something that Norman said about Beth back in season 5. So let's find it here. One of my fellow theorists asked me this and said, did Norman specifically call Beth a light at the end of the tunnel? Now, I'm going to go ahead and post the URL for this because all I had to do was Google it and it popped right up, right? But literally, this is what he said. It's quoted in this article, so you can look it up if you want. But he says, Beth was kind of like this long, dark tunnel. Guys, he's telling us that the tunnel represents Beth. He's telling us that, okay? She was kind of like this little flame at the end of it. So she's both. She's both the tunnel and the flame. He, meaning Daryl, got closer and closer to that flame and thought maybe he could see something and maybe there would be light, and it's getting warmer and warmer, and then someone blew it out. So this is something that Norman said right after coda, right? And it goes so well with what we've said all season, that he's looking for love, and the light at the end of the tunnel for him is finding someone to love, but it's also feeling safe. And of course, nobody's ever safe physically in this world. So to them, feeling safe is just being with someone that you trust and who will always have your back and who will love you, right? So that's why there's such an emphasis on relationships in this show, because nobody can be safe physically. It's just not possible to be 100% safe all the time, right? So this really, we looked at this back in season 5, guys. It was a long time ago, but to us, this was always confirmation that he had romantic feelings for Beth. He's not saying that, he's not using those exact words, even though they have confirmed it now, right? But this is kind of what he was saying. And then somebody blew that light out that he was hoping to reach, which to me was the romantic relationship. And so that's why Daryl was heartbroken and why it was so damn tragic, right? But it's really important that they are now showing the tunnel again, which Norman said represents Beth. And they're saying there is always a light at the end of the tunnel. You see what I mean? So if I get a chance, I will try to do a deeper dive into the tunnel symbolism. It has been a long time since I revisited it. But I'm thinking now, I'll have to go back and see what they specifically said about Maggie. If I'm remembering it right, she told Glenn later that she was in the tunnel and all of the walkers showed up, and she fired her gun into the ceiling, and that brought the ceiling down on the walkers, like it crushed them beneath the concrete, and that allowed Maggie and her team to get away. And then Glenn came up behind her. Of course, she didn't know he was behind her. But that's kind of hole in the roof symbolism. And we also have someone who went from the tunnel coming back to save them. We keep saying that Beth is going to save Daryl in some way, and we don't know what that's going to look like. But that's what that feels like to me. It's just a template, and they've used it many times with more than one character, but I feel like they're telling us that this template is coming up, right? They're heading into the tunnel. What's coming out on the other side? The other thing that I wanted to mention that I kind of forgot about was that there's a shot in season 5, I don't think it's coda. I think it's the episode before that. It's crossed, where Beth goes to Edwards to get the medicine for Carol, and then when she walks out, the hallway is black, and it really does look like a dark tunnel because it's the whole passage of the hallway. The lights are off, and at the very end, the very back of that tunnel, like where she's headed, there are lights on. So it's literally she's heading into a dark tunnel with lights at the end. And to me, that was always symbolism that she's heading into the dark tunnel, which means she's going to have a brush with death, and that is her getting shot in coda. But there's light at the end. So if there's light at the end, much like we see, it's visual representation. I mean, we're seeing the same thing here with Daryl and Carol. They're in the dark tunnel and they had this brush with death, in their case, more emotional than physical, but there's a light at the end. So it tells me that anybody who goes into a dark tunnel and there's light at the end, it means they're going to come out the other side. And we saw that exact image with Beth right before she got shot in coda. So all of this is really, really important, very nuanced, but they are telling us where they're going with it. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. I loved that they used that that particular promo, because it's very, very on the nose, actually. So that's fun. That's great. Okay, so let me go back into my list here. Oh, okay, this is something that I meant to talk about in my video, and I completely spaced it because WDWA is the one who saw it, and she told me before I created my video on Sunday, and then I didn't actually write it down in my notes, so of course I didn't remember to talk about it. When, in that final scene, when Daryl is hallucinating Isabelle and she's leaning over him and says, "Bet on hope," she has a blonde curl sort of in front of her braid that's hanging down by her ear. And it looks exactly like the blonde curl from the coda in Fear the Walking Dead. So do you guys remember, was this the final season? I think it was the final season. They had a coda from the first part of the season to the second part of the season. And unless, I don't know, I might be getting that wrong. Maybe it was the previous season to the last season, something like that. But it was like when they were going away and they weren't going to come back for a few months with new episodes, where they had someone who could hear Madison's radio broadcast, and they had very fine, thin hands, and they had a blonde curl hanging down. And then in the show, the person that was supposed to be was Troy. And that's utterly ludicrous, because Troy is a man with very big man-sized hands, and he does not have blonde curls. And I half thought, okay, maybe they're going to do something stupid where when we first see him, he'll have blonde curls, and there's no reason he should. He's not blonde, but maybe he'll have grown out his hair and for some reason have blonde curls. I mean, you know, it happened with Leah where things just kind of changed for no reason, and then he'll shave it off and just be Troy again, right? And I mean, I could see them doing something like that just to account for the blonde curl, but really it's not that it was literally Beth or anything. It was more like a foreshadow or a template, right? But the thing is, they didn't even do that. They just had Troy show up looking like his normal self, and there was no blonde curl in sight. So it was ridiculous that they showed us this person that had a blonde curl hanging down and then said it was Troy. It couldn't possibly have been Troy, right? And we still don't know the answer to that. I mean, what they're going with is that it was Troy. And maybe they won't ever tell us anything different. If not, it just goes to show that they put the blonde curl in there on purpose either way, because they were hinting at something. And there's a lot of other interesting symbolism there. I mean, just the fact that there was the radio broadcast. More than once we've heard voices on a radio that ended up being important. You have Eugene and Max. That's how they came to know one another at all, was through the radio, you know, and that was a major romance arc in the show. So anyway, it's important, number one, that we had the blonde curl that was hanging down from Isabelle's hair. Of course, she is a blonde, so it's not as ridiculous as it was trying to say that blonde curl belonged to Troy in Fear the Walking Dead. But W.D. also noticed that it kind of came and went. It would be there in one shot, and the next shot it wasn't there. And then it would be back, and then it wasn't there. And yeah, you could chalk that up to just editing, like they pushed it behind her ear some of the times or something. And maybe, I mean, I could actually see that being the case here, but it's still a hint to me. I still think that they put that curl there on purpose. It's hanging down in exactly the same way, so we can see it pretty obviously, and then it comes and goes. So just really, really suspicious, and I love that, because obviously in like all ways, Isabelle was a Beth proxy. So I like the curl hanging down. It just makes me think all the more that that really was supposed to be Beth in Fear the Walking Dead. I still think that she has legs from the red machete. There's just a lot of things that we have not found out what they were supposed to be yet. And just the fact that they haven't told us yet is really suspicious to me, because usually we find out pretty quickly, you know. The other mini, I don't know what they called those, webisode kind of series, you know, they had other ones besides the red machete. They had some before that, and like they would have it, show it on commercial breaks for one season, and then it showed up in the very next season of Fear the Walking Dead. Like the person from that little webisode series showed up in Fear the Walking Dead one season later. Okay, Legs was like 5 seasons ago. So clearly there's some reason they don't want to tell us who that is yet. And I think it's because they did that early on, and then because of COVID, things changed, and that character still has not made an appearance yet, but they will. And I think it's going to be Beth. Anyway, so I just wanted to mention the curl thing because I forgot to talk about that in my previous video. All right, so I'm at about 15 minutes. I'm going to call this for today, but I'll be back in a couple of days with more to talk about. And be sure to send me your asks into my inbox. If you want me to talk about anything in particular, want to deep dive on anything, have any questions, because I don't have much to talk about when I don't have asks. All right, everyone. I will talk to you hopefully in the next few days. Have a wonderful week, and talk soon.